Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you, Emily, for coming. Agreed to come along, give that talk as part of our seminar series. Most of you know Emily already. She was here, but for those of you who don't, she was here. You did an internship here about 3 years ago now.
Yep.
As part of your mal placement at York. Now she's doing a PhD with David Coombs and Drew Purves here in Cambridge on predictive modelling of forest dynamics. So welcome, Emily. Looking forward to seeing your talk.
Hi, so I was saying to Matt earlier, this talk's really overdue because when I finished my internship, Steve came up to me and said, will you give a talk when you leave? And I was like, oh yeah, sure. And I haven't been back until now, so sorry about that. Right, so I'm going to be talking about my entire PhD project in modelling forest dynamics. I'm going to be talking about why it's important to model forests. And I think there are a lot of ecologists in here, so you can feel free to fall asleep for the first 10 minutes. And then I'm going to get on to my results and my project itself. So why are forests important? Well, they're really important for biodiversity. They harbour, estimates vary, but maybe 2/3 or upwards of the world's biodiversity. They have huge economic value for timber and fuel. I can't remember how many people there are supposed to be in the world now, 7 billion, but maybe 1.6 of them rely directly on forests for their livelihoods. And that's not just for timber, but also non-timber products like bushmeat, food, fruits and nuts, and things like latex can be harvested from forests. And they also provide really important ecosystem services. So they clean the air and the water, they prevent soil erosion, they store lots of carbon, they also help to regulate the climate. So they actually store more carbon than is in the atmosphere. You've probably all seen this image before. But we're losing a lot of forests each year to deforestation and degradation, accounting to, I think, 12% of global human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. And that's mainly in the tropics. So this shows forest land cover, and all of these red areas are forest losses, mostly in the tropics. But you can tell the dark green from the light green up here in the temperate regions, we're seeing actually a gain in forest cover, and that's primarily due to land abandonment from less intensive farming, less uphill farming, for example, and forests are regrowing on that land. So we know that forests are changing, but why do we need to model them? Well, it's probably obvious to a lot of you, but it's good to think on timescales for this. A lot of biological sciences, you'd maybe take your organism in a laboratory and do some manipulations, record your observations. But my PhD is hopefully a little bit less than 4 years. Maybe if I have a good research career, it'll last 40 years, but this tree will live over 200 years. So I can't sit around waiting to see what happens to this. I need to simulate what's going to happen so I can make predictions. If I wait for it, then all the impacts will have happened, the forest will have changed, and I won't be able to do anything about it. So forest models are important in order to link all of these threats and impacts that we know are happening to forests around the world to things that we care about forests, like their biodiversity, the amount of carbon they store, their productivity. And through simulation models, we can predict the dynamics and then stick in different management practices, stick in different disturbance regimes and see what effect that has on the things that we care about. So the processes governing forest dynamics in a typical forest model would be things like recruitment, so individual trees arriving in the forest, how they grow, what shape they take, which affects the shade that they cast and therefore the competition interactions with other trees in the forest, and also how they die. So we can take these individual-based models of forests, run some simulations, that gives us whole stand predictions for biomass, for species composition, and processes are influenced by sunlight, so light availability, big driver of forest dynamics, and also climate and especially because we know the climate's going to change. We're interested in how that will impact forest dynamics. So there are lots of forest models going back many decades. The first ones were simple productivity models for plantations, but some of them do have limitations. There's many just a few species in one individual location. A lot of them don't explicitly consider climate drivers in the processes, which means that we can't make accurate predictions about how changing climate will affect those processes. And some of them group species into these plant functional types by assuming, for example, all conifer species behave in the same way. So all of these limitations mean that even though there are lots of forest models, there's room for more and better forest models. One of the big limitations has been data, but now lots of companies are doing these big forest inventories where they go out and they measure individual tree locations. They record the species and the diameter, breadth, height, the standard measure for trees, sometimes things like height and crown width as well. And if you do this multiple times over many years, then you can get estimates of growth on very large scales. And we combine that with the computational advances that everyone here is working on, and that's going to give us much more accurate models and much larger scales, which are much more useful for predicting future forest dynamics. So now on to my project. Spain, it's a really great place to study forest dynamics because there's lots of forests. It's the most forested country in southern Europe. It's part of the Mediterranean basin, which is a biodiversity hotspot. There's a huge number of endemic plant species here. These are interesting forests because they're not in equilibrium. They've got a long history of human management. Things like forest fires are regular occurrences. And there's lots of regeneration following land abandonment here. One of the biggest drivers of vegetation dynamics in Spain is the very large climate gradient. So we've got very cold areas up here in the Pyrenees, and then very, very hot areas down here in the south that are also very dry. They're essentially deserts. So the vegetation moves from mountain temperate forests right down to semi-arid Mediterranean type forests. And these vegetation types have very different dynamics. And it's also predicted to become hotter and drier in the future. So we can so a lot of the global climate models agree about this, which is quite nice. So we can use that in our predictions to be more confident about the future of the forest here. So let's have a look at some of the Spanish forest types. It's got lots of tree species. To put this in context, Britain has about 30 native species. We've got over 100 in Spain. Lots of the forests are protected in some way, but that doesn't mean that they're not managed. So up here in the temperate regions, we've got these mountain pine species, beech forests, and then further south, more Mediterranean type vegetation, so Pinus pinaster, cork oak, Quercus suber, that are drought resistant. And there's a lot of management down here. If you can see, I don't know, on this picture, you can see this dark area down at the bottom of this tree. That's the cork being harvested. And these cork oak woodlands support a lot of biodiversity, and they're also managed for pasture pig farming. So if you have some nice Iberian ham, the really good stuff is from pigs eating acorns in these places. And there's also these really beautiful very endangered species. The Spanish fir is a relic from the Ice Age, and what happened was it's found up in mountains down in the south, in the southern region, because it can't actually live in the very hot areas. So it's just found in these few little islands down here, and it's really highly protected. So you can't go into these forests in the middle of August in case you start a forest fire, for example. So the Spanish really care about conserving these natural environments, and they really care about the threats to them in the future. So because forests are so important in Spain, they measure them using these inventories. This is a map of all of the forest plots that have been measured in the inventories. They use this variable radius technique, whereby they measure the smallest trees. Sorry, they measure all the trees in the smallest plot, and then as you get further away from the centre of the plot, they measure only larger and larger trees. And they've done it 3 times, but actually this first one, the exact location of the plot wasn't recorded, so they weren't able to go back and find the same trees again. So for my work, I'm just using the two inventories from 1997 and 2007, where they went back and found the same trees, so we know which ones grew, which ones died. And they recorded things like the species, diameter, height, etc.
Is this variable radius time simply to make, it's a trade-off obviously between...
Yeah, it's supposed to give a better representation of the biomass of the plot, I think, and the species composition.
I see.
But also, obviously, it's much faster to, if you're not measuring all of the trees in the whole plot. Okay. So, there were individual tree measurements for growth, mortality, and allometry, that's tree shape. So I took a very similar approach for parameterizing models of all of these processes, which is to construct some basic functional forms to describe them, fit them using an MCMC method, and then test different predictors. For example, measures of competition, so how many other trees there are around, and climate. And by doing this for individual species, we're able to tease out inter- and intra-specific differences in the processes. So I'm now going to go through, first of all, growth, allometry, and mortality, and then recruitment and how I've parameterized those models, the results that we've got for each one in turn. So we'll start with allometry. So that's tree height and crown shape. So in the inventory they measured crown width, not crown depth, unfortunately. Allometry is really important because it determines how much light a tree captures. So if it's up at the top of the canopy, it's getting lots of light. If it's not able to get that high, it's getting less light. And also how much shade it casts, so its effect on its neighbours. And also having accurate allometric equations is really important for good estimates of carbon stocks in forests. So I'm just going to look at the height model today. We use this simple power law function, which is quite standard for allometry, although we did try a couple of other functions. This one came out as the best, and we fitted it with these parameters A and B, which we actually had as functions of competition and climate. So what we found is that there was a really strong variation in allometry by species. So what these plots show is the predicted height of a 15 centimetre diameter tree. And each dot here is a different species. So the circles are the angiosperms, the broadleafs, and the triangles are the gymnosperms, the conifers. So the point in the centre is the prediction for 15 centimetres in the mean of this one. So this one here is in the centre of its precipitation range. And then these lines show how that prediction changes across the climatic range that it's found in. So here, the height of the species in the wettest place it's found, and here in the driest place. And what we found is that species, there were strong patterns of species across these gradients. So we found taller species for a given diameter in wetter areas, and we found shorter species for a given diameter in areas with longer drought. And we also found taller species in more dense plots. So this is a measure of competition that we use, the basal area of larger trees, so that's asymmetric competition. And in the plots with the most trees, we only found species that were able to get tall. But what we did find is that the changes within the species were much smaller than the changes across the species. So we might expect, for example, along drought length, a species to be able to adapt to be shorter in a drier area, which would reduce its risk of embolism and therefore branch loss and ultimately death. But we didn't really find that. What we found is actually a species would exist in a drought length range, and then it wouldn't adapt and it would just drop off. Okay, so moving on to the second process, growth.
Just a quick question about that. Is this controlling for covariance? So that's the
yeah.
Resource availability as well.
Yes. So these are plotted for this species is in its mean environment and at this size apart from drought length. So we're only looking at variation in drought length. So we fitted all predictors together,
right,
and then just look at the variation in one at a time. Okay, so let's move on to growth. So growth is one half of the productivity equation. So forests assimilate carbon by trees growing and lose it by trees dying. We use this model for growth rate. Again, it's a power function of the diameter. And we would expect this exponent to be somewhere between 0 and 1, so fast growth at small sizes and then slower growth at bigger trees. When they've reached the canopy, they don't need to grow so much. From the database, we've got 2 measurements. So they went back and remeasured the same trees about 10 years apart. Again, we use these MCMC methods. Fitted lots of climatic variables and competition together. So the way that you'd stick these into this equation isn't necessarily obvious, so there's not necessarily set rules in the literature to do this. So this is a relatively commonly used competition effect. So we have higher growth when there's fewer, so this is an asymmetric competition measure, when there's fewer larger trees, and then lower growth when the tree is more suppressed. But we didn't really know how to put a drought effect into here, so we just put in a linear one. And if we compare the different predictors that we put in, we found that this asymmetric competition was the most important, followed by precipitation and then all the others. So if we look at the effect of changing precipitation on growth, these are plotted the same way as the drought. So each line represents a species and how it changes across its own range. And I've just picked out the pines and oaks here because they're really dominant in a lot of Spanish forests. And what we can see is that a lot of the species seem to benefit from increases in precipitation. The pines seem to benefit more, so these ones seem to have steeper slopes than the oak species. But there's some that seem to suffer from being in wetter areas. So we might expect some of the Mediterranean species to suffer in the wetter areas because they're adapted to droughts, they perform best in the driest places. And actually in these wetter areas there's more competition from other trees and other plants for resources, and they perform worse down here. And again, we saw a really strong effect of asymmetric competition. So we get this highest growth rates in the most open areas, and then all of the species show this decrease in growth rate as they become more suppressed. And we see that these light-demanding pines seem to be showing a sharper decline than the less light-demanding oak trees. But all of the species showed this response. Okay, so moving on to mortality. It's not as easy to model as allometry of growth because it's a discrete process. So you go back 10 years later and either the tree that you looked at is dead or it's not. So we fitted an annual probability of mortality model here. Again, we fitted this, so we used a logistic function to constrain it to be between 0 and 1, and we fitted this k value here separately for each species, and again as a function of size, climate competition in the same way. And what we found, again, asymmetric competition is the most important driver here, and size is really important as well. Here we can see the changes in annual mortality rates of pines across their range of asymmetric competitive environment and oaks. And we see the pines suffer more, which we would expect because we expect them to be more light-demanding species. And some of the oaks even don't seem to be suffering that much, even when they're in quite densely competitive environments. And we saw that size was a really important driver of mortality. So we get higher mortality rates in the smallest trees, which we expect to be suffering the most competition, and it decreases into the larger canopy trees. Now, we did the same analysis on some US trees and found an upturn in mortality, so larger mortality at larger sizes, which we didn't find in Spain. This U-shaped mortality with size seems to be has been found in quite a few different forests, so we're a little bit of a loss of why we didn't find it here in Spain. One possible reason is that these are quite managed forests. Often the largest trees are in forests that are quite managed to be quite open for those pastures, for example, that we saw. So possibly they're not having a strong competitive effect that might be influencing these larger, older trees but we're not sure. So, any thoughts on this?
And just to check, Emily, obviously that must mean that you had a functional form that allowed.
Yeah, it allowed it to, and it just didn't. Yeah.
And so, did it not pick the parameters that did that, or did you end up rejecting that functional form just for a different functional form in the end?
It didn't pick the parameters
Yeah,
to
right.
do that. Yeah.
It's kind of strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's, you know, I mean, it's, by the time you get something you've observed in 3 or 4 different forests, you think, you know,
well,
you might find a rare example of like generality in ecology.
So the sort of the bottom out of these mortality rates might be around 30 centimetres here, and we're not getting a lot of really big trees in Spain. Yeah. So that's one possible reason. But yeah, we are a little bit at a loss why that is. Okay, so moving on to the final process, recruitment. So the inventory.
I'm sorry to slow you down. Can we just go back just a second? Because in the US analysis, you didn't explicitly account for competition on that mortality.
No, we did.
We did as well. So, so it was up to. I know I was involved in it. I'm sorry, I've forgot that detail. So you've got U-shaped, even when you've taken out the effect of competition.
Yeah, we didn't fit this as asymmetric competition. This was just total plot basal area in here as a predictor.
So checking both sides for that. It looks as though there's a different mechanism for mortality applying in the US that comes in at a certain point that isn't present.
Yeah, I mean, we hypothesised that this might be a senescence effect, or larger trees might be more affected by diseases or big wind events, for example, that could knock them over.
Hang on, what are we talking? So 30 centimetres dBH. How tall is that going to be? What sort of height is that?
It's a big tree.
That's quite that's what?
Yeah, these oaks can still be quite small.
Double figures metres at least.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But
sorry, I was thinking herbivory.
Right, yeah.
As a possible.
Yeah, which is a big effect in some of these forests.
If you've got a lot of herbivory pressure from relatively small herbivores, then once you've got to a certain size, you might just escape that and run away, and that could give you a U. But
that would.
I think the size of the tree is too big anyway, probably, to explain that. You know, you haven't got giraffes wandering around the States.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned. I don't think that fits anyway. Yeah.
So you just think they're never getting large enough because the herbivores might be eating them all out here?
I just thought that might be a possible thing where you can imagine larger trees suddenly having a reduced growth rate if they're kind of just getting bigger than
they die more than when they get really big. The mortality,
sorry, I'm reading it the wrong way up. It's
up.
mortality, not survival.
Yeah.
Exactly. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was reading that.
Well, it's something that we haven't considered, and it'd be worth thinking about those effects.
I think they're too big though, yeah. It's too big, isn't it? Anyway.
It's worth pointing out too that all the longest lived trees in the world occur in dry forests too, so it could be something to do with adaptation to drought, for example, that favors longevity. Yeah,
so I guess some of these might be rare climate events that maybe wouldn't be affecting. But then some of these species, I mean, Pinus sylvestris, Pinus incinata, those are temperate species, they're not drought adapted. Those find up in the north of Spain. So
interesting to take similar variables from Spain, take a matching variance in the US.
well, this is northeastern US, so
Invasive diseases? Does Spain suffer a lot from invasive tree diseases, which I don't know if they're size biased, but obviously it could be there's loads of small ones dying anyway. But you know, you tend to, characteristic is sudden loss of large species, isn't it? Oak, dieback and so on, and large individuals. So does Spain suffer from invasive plant diseases? No, the US certainly does, right?
Yeah, well, it'd be sort of the other way around. So, you know, again, it's in the US where they're dying faster when they get big.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite striking to see, you know, because these are all done independently, right? You don't have do you have a hierarchy over the parameters?
no.
So, you know, there's nothing encouraging them to be similar, and yet they clearly are choosing to be similar. And similarly in the US, right, we didn't put a hierarchy on those ones. And again, you know, there's nothing and they all, it looks like a very clear result, you know, like I said. And I think, so I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities, but it's interesting to see. And, you know, it's a nice result, I think, because you can sort of say, oh, you know, people thought that U-shaped mortality was like this universal thing in forest, and I've shown it isn't. So I mean, it's nice for publishing a paper. I personally find it a bit like, you know, it's a bit like, damn, I thought we had one generality.
It does, seem a little bit like an anomaly. Although we don't seem to we've got a few different ideas of why this is happening, but nothing really very definite that then we can say is this happening in Spain.
The range in Spain is much. The range in Spain is the range in Spain is much lower.
Yes,
than,
it is.
in the US.
Yeah.
It's not much lower though, to be fair. Is it?
And are
Because
you
of
going?
pines, but the
Are you
oaks
going
do.
to the larger trees anyway? In Spain, you're sampling the largest that the trees get there roughly anyway.
Yeah, well, they sampled every square kilometre of
Yeah,
forest in Spain, so it's what's there.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Thoughts on a postcard? Okay, so mortality, growth and allometry we had nice individual based measurements for, but not so much recruitment. This inventory was mostly done for forestry reasons, because Spain has, it's a really valuable resource in Spain, and they don't really care so much about small trees because they don't provide much timber. So they didn't measure anything smaller than 7.5 centimetres diameter, which is quite a big tree. What they did do is in the smallest central plot, they counted up for each species how many saplings there were approximately between 2.5 and 7.5 centimetres diameter.
Frustrating because the established recruitment success meant we really distant from the period of plan.
Yeah, but we've got no spatial locations for those, sadly. So I couldn't use that MCMC method that we used for the other three processes. But why do we care? Well, juvenile dynamics are really vital for determining things like species composition and succession. If you're not able to regenerate underneath your own canopy, then another species is likely to take over from you. And what we might expect was there would be more saplings where there are more parent trees, so where there are more conspecific trees, we would expect them to produce more small trees. But we might also expect fewer saplings in dense plots where there's less light reaching the forest floor. So this gives us an idea of how to possibly set up a model for recruitment. So I use this approach called Approximate Bayesian Computation, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So in all those previous processes, what we have is an observed process like growth and some data, individual tree growth, and then we have an individual tree model that makes predictions, and we compare these two using a likelihood, and that gives us the parameters for our model. But in this case, I don't have that data, so I want to know what the recruitment is, what the recruitment rates are, say, for example, each year, how many new trees are arriving. I don't have that. What I have is some summary data, a summary of how many small trees there are in total. So what ABC does, Approximate Bayesian Computation does, is instead of comparing predictions with individual data, it compares summary predictions with summary data. So this is like, it's not used the same way as a likelihood, but this is what we're using in the place for likelihood to do this parameter estimation. So we need a simulation model, and I'm interested not just in recruitment, but also the growth and mortality of these small trees. So we use a simple cohort model whereby at each time step I introduce a new cohort of small trees and apply growth functions to all the ones that already exist and killed off some of the ones that already exist as well. So that requires three functions: a growth rate, a mortality rate, and a recruitment rate. Now, I didn't really know anything about what this recruitment rate might be, but we did know something about the growth and mortality because we had all the data from the adult trees. So what I could do is constrain these functions here using priors based on the adult tree processes. So these weren't fixed, the annual growth rates of these small trees wasn't fixed to be identical to the adult conspecifics, but it was fixed to be quite similar. And then I used very uninformative prior on the parameters for this recruitment model, which was going to be a function of how many conspecifics there were and also the total plot basal area, so the total competitive environment. So the cohort model produced something like this, a predicted size distribution for small trees, and then to get the summary predictions, we just added up how many there were between 2.5 and 7.5 centimetres diameter. Gives us a density, and that's what we can compare then to that density from the central plot here. So it's in the same format, and then so we can compare it. We use this Cartesian distance metric. And these are the results that it gave. For some, I've just plotted a few of the species out here. So we can see that recruitment rates, so this is number of 1 centimetre diameter saplings per hectare per year, would increase with the base area of the conspecific adults, as we would expect, but it also decreases when the competition in the plot is too high. So this is what we hypothesized would happen, but we can also see big interspecific differences in these recruitment rates.
So Emily, it's not possible for trees to immigrate into the plot bed if there's no adults already there?
That's not what we modelled, no. But we, if you think about the structure of the plot, we were looking at densities in the very smallest plots, but using adult densities from the whole plot. So they were able to be affected by trees that were 20 metres away from them. But no species from outside the plot. Okay. So just some conclusions about what we found about the drivers of Spanish forest dynamics. We found that for all of the processes, competition was a really big influence, asymmetric competition in particular. And we tested whether it was symmetric or asymmetric. Asymmetric always came out as a better predictor of these processes. And we also found that it had a much larger impact on the light-demanding pine species than it did on the oaks. We also found that aridity and precipitation levels affected the processes, and these are predicted to change with climate change. So we know that the responses of the forests are going to change in the future. And we also found that there was a lot of differences between the species in the way they responded. So using these common plant functional type responses may not be appropriate in somewhere like Spain, where you've got very large variation in forest dynamics. So some overall conclusions of this project. These national forest inventories can be used to parameterize these models for very many species. There's plenty of data available, and these nice computational methods, as developed by Drew, make this really easy. They're very well developed and very effective. And we can quantify individual species responses, so how individual species processes change along the environment. But just looking at one of these processes on its own doesn't really tell us what will happen in the future, and we know that they will interact to create whole forest dynamics. So the final step of my project is to put all of these in to a simulation model, which will then produce estimates of biomass and carbon stock, predictions of successional dynamics and stand structure, and how, because we've parameterized these as functions of climate, we can then predict how all of these things will change in response to changing climate. But sadly, I don't have any results of that to show you as yet. So thanks to my supervisor David, Drew, Miguel in Spain, Paloma who did the mortality work, and thanks for listening to me.